Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the epic rise and the absolutely devastating fall of one of history's most complex figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. We're going to see exactly how a young military student from Corsica managed to climb the ranks, conquer a massive chunk of Europe, and then basically lose it all in a spectacular collapse. The mechanics of power and ambition really haven't changed much in 2 centuries, which makes his blueprint for absolute control incredibly relevant today. So let's just dive right into it. Right off the bat, looking at this heroic portrait, you perfectly capture how Napoleon wanted to be seen, and honestly, how he was recognized. He was, without a doubt, one of the world's greatest military geniuses. This is a figure who deeply impacted the Western world with sheer tactical brilliance. Just look at the commanding presence here. This is a guy who was fully prepared to forge an empire and completely reshape history. To really understand his rise and ultimate ruin, we'll be following a quick roadmap today. 1. Rising to power. 2. Reforming the French state. 3. Forging a European empire. 4. 3 costly imperial mistakes. And finally, 5. The final downfall. All right, Section 1. Rising to power. Let's see exactly how Napoleon takes control. Following the revolution, France was literally in a state of chaos, and that volatile environment provided the perfect ladder for a highly ambitious military man. But before we talk about his initial power grab, we really need to nail down this critical term, coup d'état. It translates directly from French as a stroke of state. Basically, it's a sudden, often violent takeover of a government. And for Napoleon, this was the pivotal mechanism for his grand entry onto the world's political stage. The timing of it all is just fascinating. It's 1799, Napoleon has just returned from a military campaign down in Egypt. He arrives to find the French government, which was then run by a 5-member committee called the Directory, struggling, and quite frankly, deeply unpopular. So using that exact tactic we just defined, a coup d'état, Napoleon swiftly overthrew the Directory. And he didn't pull this off alone. He did it with the crucial help of his wife, Josephine. Together, they successfully seized political control, and Napoleon wasted no time setting up a dictatorship. But here's where Napoleon really shows his political cunning. See, raw military power just wasn't enough. He needed the appearance of legitimacy to truly secure his rule. Because at the end of the day, people want to feel like they have a say in their governance, right? Which brings us to this fascinating political maneuver known as a plebiscite. Essentially, it's a direct vote by the people, but in this specific context, he used it strategically to try and create this image of being a freely elected dictator. So the crucial point here is exactly how he executed this illusion of choice. By holding a plebiscite in 1800, he allowed the citizens to vote on a new constitution, which, remarkably, was the 4th constitution the country had seen in just 8 years. Exhausted by all the chaos, the voters overwhelmingly approved it. This officially handed all real power to Napoleon under the shiny new title of First Consul. He effectively wrapped his absolute dictatorship right in the comfortable, familiar illusion of democracy. Moving on to Section 2, reforming the French state and bringing order and stability. Because once he actually had absolute power, he proved he wasn't just some warlord. He was a fiercely organized administrator, intent on restoring order to France. This collage really captures his sweeping domestic wins. First off, he supported the ideas of the revolution by creating a strong central government. He made tax collection much more fair, and he established a national bank to basically root out corrupt, dishonest government workers. He even set up a brand new public school system called lycées. On top of that, he signed an agreement known as the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, which gave the church back some of its power and repaired that crucial relationship. And finally, we have his absolute proudest achievement, the Napoleonic Code. This was a comprehensive set of laws that gave all French citizens the same rights and eliminated a lot of injustices. Now, a huge caveat here. While it offered stability, it also stripped away some previously won rights and, terribly, actually restored slavery in the colonies. But ultimately, these reforms gave France so much stability that he felt confident enough to literally take the crown from the Pope's hands and place it directly on his own head, naming himself emperor. All right, Section 3. Forging a European empire and taking control of Europe. As you can probably guess, Napoleon wasn't satisfied just being the head of France. He wanted to control the entire European continent. But to build that kind of empire, he needed cash, and a lot of it. That staggering $15 million you see represents the price for which he sold the massive Louisiana territory to the United States. He made a highly calculated decision to completely abandon his imperial ambitions in the New World purely to bankroll his massive upcoming European conquests. Now, fearful of Napoleon's exploding ambitions, Britain persuaded Russia, Austria, and Sweden to ally against France. Napoleon, of course, met this challenge with his usual boldness. In a series of brilliant, lightning-fast battles, he crushed this opposition, eventually forcing the rulers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia to sign peace treaties. He literally built the largest European empire since the Romans. But the stark contrast here is his naval performance. While he dominated on land, his navy was utterly decimated by the British at the Battle of Trafalgar. This single naval defeat was a massive game-changer. It forced Napoleon to scrap his plans of invading Britain, and it ensured absolute British naval supremacy for the next 100 years. Ironically, it also awakened a fierce sense of nationalism, national loyalty, among the very people he had just conquered. Which brings us to Section 4, 3 Costly Imperial Mistakes. We've officially reached the turning point of our explainer, because Napoleon's own personality, specifically his limitless love of power, ultimately posed the greatest threat to his empire. His relentless desire to extend French rule led directly to his empire's collapse through 3 fatal, incredibly costly mistakes. First up was the continental system. In 1806, hoping to crush the British economy, he ordered a massive blockade to stop all trade between Britain and the rest of Europe. But it failed miserably. Europeans just secretly smuggled goods, and Britain responded with a much stronger, way more effective counterblockade. Mistake number 2 was the Peninsular War, a totally draining conflict in Spain, where he faced fierce, unending resistance from Spanish peasant fighters using unconventional guerrilla tactics. But the third, and honestly perhaps the worst mistake of all, was his fateful decision in 1812 to march far to the east and try to conquer Russia. The Russian invasion was pretty much immediately doomed, thanks to the brilliant strategy of the retreating Russian army. Rather than fight Napoleon head-on, they employed this brutal but highly effective defensive tactic, the scorched earth policy. They deliberately burned their own fields and slaughtered their own livestock as they retreated. This ensured that Napoleon's advancing troops would find absolutely nothing to eat in the harsh, desolate terrain. To really understand the sheer scale of this blunder, just consider this single haunting number. Napoleon proudly marched into Russia with a grand army of more than 400,000 soldiers. They actually made it as far as Moscow, but winter was coming. Forced to head back, they were absolutely decimated by bitter cold, crippling hunger, and relentless hit-and-run attacks by the Russians. Thousands died, thousands more just deserted. By the time he finally stumbled out of Russian territory, out of that grand army of 400,000, only this tiny fraction, 10,000 soldiers, survived and were fit to fight again. This stark visual contrast perfectly captures his dramatic, Icarus-like arc. On one hand, you have the glorious, triumphant commander rearing up on a powerful steed, looking completely in control of the world and his destiny. And on the other, the grim, freezing, horrific reality of an empire collapsing in the snows of Russia, with a defeated leader trudging miserably alongside his dying men. It is without a doubt one of the most drastic reversals of fortune in all of human history. Finally, Section 5, the final downfall. The empire collapses. With his grand army decimated and his untouchable aura of invincibility totally shattered, well, the sharks began to circle. This timeline highlights just how quickly the whole shebang unraveled. Sensing weakness, Sweden and Austria joined forces and defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in Germany in 1813. By 1814, he was forced to give up his throne entirely and was exiled to the tiny Italian island of Elba. The French throne was then handed over to King Louis XVIII, but the new king quickly became super unpopular, with peasants terrified he was going to undo the revolution's land reforms. Hearing this, Napoleon boldly escaped Elba in March 1815, returning to France to seize power again in a breathless, dramatic sprint known as the 100 Days. But the rest of the European powers weren't having it. They immediately raised armies against him. Led by the Duke of Wellington, they met Napoleon in Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo, handing him his final crushing defeat. He was then sent far, far away to the remote island of St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, where he eventually died in 1821. As we wrap up this explainer, Napoleon's legacy leaves us with a truly profound question to ponder. This was a man who brought revolutionary reforms and undeniable stability to a fractured nation, yet his absolute, unquenchable thirst for more power ultimately destroyed everything he built. So take a moment to reflect on this. Does limitless ambition inevitably lead to self-destruction? Thank you so much for exploring the incredibly complex rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte with us today.